Oh, well, after a great narrative and telling of the Exodus account, Exodus out of Egypt, we get to now look at the book of the Torah that has caused the death of more year-long Bible reading plans than any other, right? How many of you have experienced this? Are you faithful readers that have made it this far in usually what starts out as a January resolution to read the Bible through in a year, right? Will have their hopes, their dreams collapse under the weight of the mundane listings of how to offer sacrifices. Anybody been there before? Am I the only one that would admit that happened to me? Well, despite all of our rejection and downplay of Leviticus that occurred for probably most of us as we were growing up. I mean, did y'all hear very many sermon series out of Leviticus growing up in traditional expressions of faith? Probably not. You might get one every now and then, but not very often. But despite that, from us, for the Jewish community, Leviticus is essential. Leviticus is where they typically start when they start teaching their children the Torah. It's one of the first things that they read, one of the first things that they memorize, because it's very practical and very tangible. It's not something theoretical. It's not something philosophical. It's not some religious concept. It's a very simple list of actions and things of how to do things. And it establishes and reinforces, most of all, the holiness of God. Even without the temple, even without the tabernacle, for the Jewish community today, it still reinforces the holiness of God. When you're looking at the people in this day, now that they have the tabernacle, now that it's completed, now that it's functioning, now that the Shekinah has filled it, they need to know. All the people need to know how they are supposed to interact with God now that He is in their midst. I mean, if you have the tabernacle within your camp, I mean, how close can I walk by this tabernacle? Do I just get to walk in anytime I want to? I wouldn't try that. I wouldn't risk that. What kind of procedure, what kind of protocol do I need to follow in order to enter into the presence of the King? In a lot of ways we need to think of these offerings, these sacrifices, like you would a security protocol. Better than the one at the airport if you're going out on a flight. Where you start here at the terminal and you do your check-in and they take your luggage out and they take it to the aircraft and they scan it and check it in, and you have to come over here and go through all their scans and all the other crazy things that they have to do, and then you finally get through some other things and check on and get onto your plane. You have to carry on and go through all of these different procedures just to get on the plane. You and your carry-on, you'll both pass through this scanner. They'll pat you down. Sometimes will let a dog inspect you for drugs. They'll even make you take off your shoes if you remember all that stuff. Surrender your bottle of water because bottles of water are very dangerous. All just so you can get on the plane. You have to make an offering, essentially, of your privacy and in many ways your dignity. Right or wrong, love them or hate them, if you're not willing to follow those procedures or put up with them, are you going to get on that plane? No, you're not. Some, like my family, we have not flown commercially since before 9/11. And in part it's because we've not been able to afford to. But there are many others that have not flown anywhere, even if they could afford to, because they don't want to go through all of that. Right? They don't want to go through, they object to all of those kinds of searches. Well, if you want to appear before Adonai, what we read about here in Leviticus is the protocol. This was the training manual for the priests and the people for what is required of you when God dwells in your midst. And as soon as he shows up, as soon as his glory comes down, security increases. The protocols increases. The same kind of thing happens when the president comes to town. There's an advanced team that shows up and prepares everything long before he gets there. They check every building, they check over the route, they shut down the streets, they shut down traffic. There is heavily armed Secret Service agents to intercept people. They'll even intercept with, if bullets are flying, they'll jump in the way. They have a special bulletproof car, a special plane that has all sorts of top secret defenses that's meant to stay in the air almost indefinitely, even in the event of nuclear war. I remember when I was in high school, I had moved back to Texas from California, but I came out to visit some friends, and they just happened to be going and playing for the president at the time with the high school band that I used to be a part of. And so they said, "Hey, well, since you're here, why don't you join us?" And so I was okay. I got one of the uniforms, got one of the instruments, and we started having to go through all of those kind of security protocols to enter into the grounds so we could stand there and play a song or two in front of the president. And they even had us, when we came up with the instrument, they had to, we'll put the mouthpiece in. They inspected the instrument. They took the mouthpiece, I had to put it back in, and I had to prove I could play a note on that instrument before they would let me go on. I had to just go, boop, and that was it. Okay, you can go. It was just kind of crazy. And when I was looking up these pictures, airport security protocols and presidential security protocols, I'm sure I'm getting an extra source look from the NSA and some other things just right this morning, because I did searches on airport security and presidential security. They're probably taking a closer look at me. But for the regular people, when the president comes to town, for the regular people in town, the president's visit is mostly a pain and a frustration because of how it changes everything of how they go about their regular daily life. But God's dwelling place, which, that's the goal of the tabernacle, that has these security protocols. God is not worried about his safety, right? He's not afraid of us. There's nothing from us that is a threat to him. If anything, all of these protocols are protection for who? For us. God is very careful. He is careful that his holiness is not violated, because if you do violate it, well, let's just say that something much faster and more powerful than the Secret Service will descend upon you, right? And it's not likely that you're going to survive the experience. That is the holiness of God. But as much as we may struggle with Leviticus, it reveals a lot about the heart of God. It contains the heart of God. The heart of the Torah is right here in Leviticus. And, the authors of the New Testament, they expected their readers to understand how this system works. Because there are so many parallels, there are so many references within the New Testament, because what is described in Leviticus governs the life of the Jewish people. For some, like the priests and the Levites, serving in Jerusalem, it governed every day, every moment of their day, their work life, their work experience. For many others, Jewish men in particular, at minimum, how many times are they going to have to experience and deal with these protocols? At least how many times? At least 3 times a year, right? When they're going up for the feasts, when they would participate for those. And so Leviticus is very important for their understanding of life. And it starts out with this one, with this word, varikra, and he called. The way this starts out, now Adonai called to Moses and spoke to him out of the tent of meeting, saying, and Adonai called is really the more literal. By starting with that word and, Leviticus it's just a continuation of what has come before. where the completion of the tabernacle closed the book of Exodus. God's dwelling presence, his Shekinah was there, hidden within the cloud. Leviticus is talking about how the tabernacle functions, how it operates during, essentially what we would think of in terms of regular business hours. And, when we've looked at the Aramaic Targums and such a bit lately. This time, I'm looking at the Jerusalem Targum. It has an interesting intro as well. And if you remember that it often uses the idea of the word in the Aramaic Targums, the memra in Aramaic. It's essentially the same as John's use of the word. It's a representative manifestation of God's presence. And look at, of course, the Targums have a bit extra commentary of things, but look at how it phrases this. It says, and it was when Moshe had completed to erect the tabernacle, to anoint it and sanctify it and all its vessels, that Moshe reasoned in his heart and said, within Mount Sinai, whose majesty was the majesty of an hour, and its holiness the holiness of an hour, I might not ascend till the time which was bidden me from before the Lord, nor into the tabernacle of ordinance, whose majesty is an eternal majesty, and its holiness an everlasting holiness. Is it right for me to enter till the time that I am bidden from before the Lord? He's not going to go in until the Lord tells him to and invites him to. And then it says, and the word of the Lord called to Moshe. For the word of the Lord was altogether with him from the tabernacle of ordinance, saying. So again, stop there for a second. It's the word. And if in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and it's the Word that became flesh and tabernacled among us, then according to the Targum, who is really calling to Moses from the tabernacle? Yeshua is. The Messiah is calling Moshe. That's a pretty big deal, don't you think? So when you think about it, why is Leviticus important? Because Yeshua, he is still calling his people. Yeshua is still very much calling his people to him. When you look at the word, Vayikra, this is the word that is built around kara. It means to call or to call out. And it's to recite, read, cry out, or proclaim. But I really like this one. It also means to summon, to invite, and to call for. Again, that's all within that first couple of verses there. And then it can also mean when you are summoned, when you are invited and called for, you are called and commissioned or appointed or endowed with a certain role, a certain task, a certain job, a certain mission. That's why he's bringing you into his presence, so you can accomplish this thing. The reality of the creator of the universe calling us before him, calling at all, is a miracle. Because he didn't have to, but he chooses to. He does. He reveals himself in our midst. He calls us to himself in order to draw us close and then commission us, purpose us for his kingdom, for his goals. And in various places, people are called, when you read in the Gospels and in Yeshua's life, people are called to follow him, right? They're called to be fishers of men. They're called to be a disciple, and then also to make disciples, right? In other places, he calls to those who are weary and heavy laden. Because what does the word desire to do? Give them rest. Right? Believers in Yeshua are called to continue in this kind of calling that happens here in the Torah. When you read in 1 Peter chapter 1, he says, instead, just like the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves also in everything you do. For it is written, Kedoshim you shall be, for I am Kadosh. God calls us to be holy like him, holy, set apart. He expects that of us because we are made in his image, right? We are to be like him. We are like him by in that nature that he bestows upon us. It's whether we are living in that calling or rejecting it. That's what really matters. Are we living holy as he is holy? Because he is holy by his nature, and he calls us to reflect that holiness in our lives. And even though that image in us has been corrupted by our sin, what's his goal in all of this? Doesn't he want to restore that in us? Restore us to our original beauty, right? And how are we holy? How can we be holy in everything that we do? I mean, my first thought, and certainly the thought that most of us probably grew up with, is, well, that's not even possible, right? That's usually our first thought, and that's usually mine. I'll be the first one to admit that. But one thing, realize that the calling is there to be holy, and it's a call whether you think it's possible or not. It's not up to you to determine the terms of the calling. He says this is what you're supposed to be. Far too many of us use the excuse, well, I can't do that. I can't be perfectly holy. And we use that as an excuse to sometimes not to try to be holy at all. But what would it say about the nature of God? Would God really call you and I to an impossible task? I mean, what does that say about him if you believe that? And maybe he gives you and I, in his calling, maybe he gives you and I the means by which the impossible becomes possible. And, in speaking about another impossible task, he says exactly that thing. When he talks about salvation, Yeshua says in Mark chapter 10, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And the disciples were even more astonished, saying among themselves, then who can be saved, right? That's their conclusion. Well, if that's, we can't do that, we certainly can't do this. Looking at them, Yeshua said, with men it is impossible, but not with God. For all things are possible with God. He calls us to that life of holiness, and then he instructs us, shows us, empowers us the way to do that. Leviticus is God's instructions on holiness. And since we think it's impossible, or since we think we have nothing that we can contribute in that process to the holiness of our lives, well, it's no wonder that most of the time Leviticus is ignored and not really paid attention to. It's a reason why we always kind of fall off the wagon when it comes to our Bible reading plan when we get to Leviticus. But, it's as if Peter expects his readers, when he was looking at that 1 Peter passage, he expects his readers to be familiar with the book of Leviticus. Because if you believe Peter, if you believe that he was an inspired writer by the Holy Spirit, by the Ruach HaKodesh, to write what he did, that statement that he read, be holy for I am holy, guess what book it's found in? It's in Leviticus, Leviticus chapter 11. Again, it's as if he expects them to know that, to be familiar with it, familiar with that call to holiness within this book. And if you come across people who will say, well, that's for the Levites, that's for the priests, that's for the Jewish people, that's not talking about anything for me now that I am in Messiah. Notice that Peter thinks this calling remains for the believer. He says, as you come to him, as you come to Messiah Yeshua, a living stone rejected by men but chosen by God and precious, you, and he's talking about believers in Messiah, also as living stones are being built up as a spiritual house, a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Messiah Yeshua. Now, if you've never read the book of Leviticus, would much of that make sense? If you had no exposure to the book of Leviticus, would you get that? No, you wouldn't. Or again, he says in chapter 2, but you, again, believers in Yeshua, are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the praises of the one who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Again, if you don't know anything about Leviticus, that's going to be hard to understand. Perhaps we should have a better working knowledge of the priests and the Levites, because something about their life, something about what God asks them to do, something about their ministry gives us understanding to our own walk with Messiah and how we navigate through this world. Or consider what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 12. I urge you therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service or your worship. You know, I heard this verse a lot when I was growing up. You know why? Because we didn't put it in the context of Leviticus. It was we were comfortable with this one because we think of it as an abstract concept or some idea. But when Paul is saying this, it was not very abstract to them. Most of his readers had experienced the idea or the practice of sacrifice in some way or another. Whether you were a pagan or a Jewish believer, you know, for any former pagan who was now a believer in Yeshua, most of them would have gone to one of their, pagan temples and participated in sacrifice at some point, right? That was pretty common, pretty standard. They may have seen the wrong way to do it, but it was still a very real, tangible idea. They got to see it all the time at work. They had seen a sacrifice with their own eyes. You know, for the Jews, the temple was still standing when Paul wrote this. When Peter wrote as well, the temple was still very much there. So they have seen the correct way, seen a sacrifice with their own eyes, participated in that. It was not an abstract idea or concept. It was very real. They all had some idea of sacrifice. Even if they had the wrong idea, they knew what sacrifice was. And when you're talking about the gospel, when you're talking about sharing your faith in Messiah, what's one of the central points about it? That Yeshua is an acceptable and an atoning sacrifice. That better not be just an abstract idea. That needs to be something tangible for us. And so long as we ignore Leviticus, we actually diminish our ability to fully understand just what he did on our behalf on the cross. We diminish our ability to understand his call to holiness, his call to be a royal priesthood, to be a living sacrifice. We actually need to study Leviticus and as Gentiles more so we can understand what these things actually mean. Think about it like this. Before coming to Messiah, the pagans in the world were doing sacrifices all the time. They'd be doing some type of cleansing rituals, things like a mikvah or baptism. They would have seen the priests and the priestesses. And that was their understanding and their experience of all of those ideas, and they had to get those ideas out of their head, didn't they? Because when they would hear an evangelist like Paul start talking about the sacrifice of Yeshua, of being a living sacrifice, what context are they going to try to put that in? What's going to come to mind first? They're going to try to make sense of it through what they have experienced through all of those pagan temples and things. And when they hear about priests, the men are going to wonder, hey, I wonder if they got any of those priestesses in this new religion, because, we would kind of like those. Why aren't there any of the female priests? Should we bring a sacrifice to the synagogue, and why not? See, they had no idea how to conduct themselves in this new way of life. Fortunately, in every synagogue around that Mediterranean world, it's going to be filled with Jewish believers, hopefully. These Jews and Gentiles are going to be coming together, believers in Messiah, and most of those Jews have been to Jerusalem at least once. They try to make a pilgrimage there. There'd be somebody there who has been to Jerusalem, and they would be able to relate their experience with going to Jerusalem for one of the feasts. They'd be able to explain, in bringing an offering, a sacrifice to the temple, explain the role of the priests and the difference from them and the Levites. How the priests and the Levites have different roles and functions, right? All priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. And sometimes, even still, I don't always understand all that stuff, right? Anybody else have that perfectly down? These Jews could explain and relate their experience with the mikvah, with baptism, how to worship God in spirit and in truth, and not the way of their paganism. No, what we're doing here is not like what you used to do. How the feast days are really different from the pagan festivals that they've grown up with. How they can explain how they're not supposed to be blended or mixed together. And in explaining, sacrifices and offerings, they would explain Yeshua, and they would probably turn to the book of Leviticus to do it. Reading Leviticus is an essential part of helping a pagan change the way they think and understand their faith, and understand what sacrifices and atonement and all of these different things that are there in the Scriptures. Sacrifices in the pagan world are done for much different reasons. You're trying to appease whatever God there is. You're actually trying to bribe the God for favor. Your God may be hungry and needs to be fed. The God has no care or concern for you at all unless you bring it something that it wants. But God requires things in a certain ways for certain reasons that don't fit those kind of patterns. Think about it like this. How many of y'all have ever played a sport, been on a team, had a coach? Anybody? Just one other person? Nobody? Everybody's afraid to raise their hand? This is not a hand-raising church, apparently. So y'all have been on a sports team. You've been coached, things like that. You've learned how to play the game. Maybe the coach, he taught you the plays, they taught you the position, where to put your hands, how to move your feet. And you actually think you know how to play the game. And it makes sense for you to play. When I play the game, I play it like this. But then what happens when you get a new coach? Does the game change? Oh, yes. The game can change a lot. The new coach, they're playing the same game, but he has a totally different approach to the game, a different philosophy that goes far beyond just a new playbook. Some of them, you have a whole different system, even a different language, a different hand signs and signals, that the things that you used to do that may have worked so well under your old coach now don't work at all. And your new coach tells you, you're not supposed to do that anymore. The things that may have come so naturally, because that was when you learn, the first way you learn it is the way that you do it naturally, right? But your new coach teaches you to stop, tells you that way of doing it is wrong, and this is the only right way to do now that you're on a new team with a new coach. It's even though you're playing the same game, it's as if you're playing a different game, right? Anybody experienced that before? If we have grown up largely ignoring Leviticus, not living or practicing or studying Leviticus because, it's not for us, it's for the Jews or whatever else, not learned about holiness or the kind of things that God requires, His way of doing things, then what way have we learned? If we haven't learned the biblical way, what's the only alternative for the way that we've learned? That's man's way. That's really a more pagan way than His way. Are we more like the Jewish ways of doing things and thinking, or more like the pagan way? Leviticus helps us understand really what's going on in much of the New Testament era. It helps us understand the conversations, the teachings, the debates, because Leviticus coaches us to understand that world and how it operates. And I really don't have time to develop all of the examples that are just in this first Torah portion, these first 5 chapters. You look at some of the examples. In Leviticus 3:17, there's that statement about not eating fat or blood. Does that show up in the New Testament anywhere? Sure it does. Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council. Leviticus 2:13, when it talks about the covenant of salt. Well, when Yeshua says you are the salt of the earth, you think there might be a connection to the covenant of salt? You think there might be a connection when he says offer yourselves as living sacrifices, and all of your sacrifices have to include what? Salt. Whoa, maybe there's a connection. Leviticus 2:9, when it talks about a soothing aroma to the Lord. You look at 2 Corinthians chapter 2, where Paul says, thanks be to God who in Messiah always leads us in triumphal procession and through us reveals everywhere the aroma of the knowledge of himself. For we are the aroma of Messiah to God among those who are being saved and those who are perishing. To the one an aroma from death, to the other an aroma from life to life. Who is competent for these things? I can tell you who's not competent for these things. Somebody who has no idea of what's in Leviticus. Has never been through that process or really studied this idea of what the sacrifices are and why are they a pleasing aroma to the Lord. I honestly don't have time to talk about all of those because I actually came so consumed with the very first example from chapter 1. And I didn't want to have you sit here all day. Because we ignore Leviticus, we don't understand the context of this discussion. Of this discussion, yeah. Mark chapter 7, he says, he was also telling them, you set aside the commands of God in order that you may validate your own tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and he who speaks evil of father or mother must be put to death. But you say, if anyone tells his father or mother, whatever you might have gained from me is korban, that is, an offering to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, making void the word of God with your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many such things, right? We don't understand that context and really all of what's going on in these phrases and statements. I have no experience with such an offering. I've never actually done anything like that. I don't know the rules or how this works or why Yeshua would have such a problem with it. But I gain a greater understanding at just looking at verse 2 of chapter 1. It says, and Adonai called to Moses and spoke to him out of the tent of meeting, saying, speak to Bnei Israel and tell them, when any one of you brings an offering to Adonai, you may present your offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock. The word offering is the word korban. Something brought near to the altar. Something brought near to the altar. That's what its goal is. That's what its purpose is. It's the first time the word is used in the Torah. And it sets the meaning and understanding for the concept in the whole rest of the scriptures. And it's that understanding that governs this conversation with Yeshua, because korban is, when you're reading the Mark passage, some people might get the impression that korban is a bad thing, that it's somehow negative. Well, we shouldn't be declaring anything korban. We shouldn't be doing any of that kind of stuff. But it's a positive, not a negative. It means something that is brought near. But there's something about this word when you break down into the letters. And I don't typically do this very often, because some people try to do it a little bit too much, right? But you look at the first letter, the letter Kof, thank you. It means behind or the last, the least, or the back of the head. The resh means a person, a head, or the highest. The beit is referring to a house or family, and it can mean in or into. And so actually right here on this point, it's kind of ironic that built into the word, the heart of the word korban is the word for house or family. And what is the person trying to do in declaring korban? They're trying to essentially get out of honoring their family. And then the nun is activity or life or abundance. That's how the letters kind of break down. And again, I try not to do this very often, but it's very telling in this point, because you go just a couple of verses later into verse 4, and it says this: he is to lay his hand, which is the word yad, on the head of the burnt offering, so that it will be accepted, which means pleased or delighted or favorable, for him to make atonement on his behalf. That hand, yad, Y is the first letter in that, or yod, I should say, is first letter in Yeshua's name. It represents the hand or one's work. The dalet represents what? Y'all remember? A door, a pathway, or a means of entry. If you are bringing your hand to the door, you're either turning the knob or you're knocking. And being accepted, pleased, delighted, or favorable is like you're being allowed entry. You're being invited in. The word for atonement is kapar. Kuf means to cover. The pei is reference to a mouth. The resh is the head. We cover, or we bow our head. We cover and close our mouth when we come into the king's presence. We don't speak until we have his word. So looking at those things again, one way of thinking about it is like this: that your hand or behind or placed on the head in order to get into the house, into the family. And what do you gain from that? You have an abundant life. That's what korban is reference to in some ways. Why did Yeshua come? That you may have life and have it what kind? More abundantly. Where is he taking us to have that abundant life? In my Father's house. Are we made part of the family? Are we counted as descendants of Abraham? Yeah. How does that happen? Does he not have to call us to his presence? That's how Peter understood things. In 1 Peter chapter 2, he says, "For you were called to this, because Messiah also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his footsteps. He committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth." You don't really understand the significance of that unless you understand that sacrificial system and how it works and how it operates. It says, when he was abused, he did not return the abuse. While suffering, he made no threats. Instead, he kept entrusting himself to the one who judges righteously. Because he was going before the king, and he was going to take his opinion more than any pronouncement of man. It says, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that we, removed from sins, might live for righteousness. It's by his wounds you were healed. And this is where it started to get to me even more. Because not only, there's that passage from Isaiah 53, not only did Yeshua bear our sins on his body, in the wounds and the stripes and those types of things, where else did he bear them? Were they not on his head? And what did he bear on his head? A crown of thorns, right? Who placed it there? It was a lot more than just the Romans that were doing that. We did that. From the beginning, we did that. You think about this. Why do thorns even exist in the first place? Because of sin. In Genesis 3, it says, "Cursed is the ground because of you. With pain will you eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles will sprout for you." That tells you that thorns and thistles had not been sprouting yet, had they? They had not been taking on this form that were painful. That is a result of the curse. These thorns and these thistles will sprout because of that fall, because of that sin. And when you look at the Septuagint, for that word for thorns, it's acantha, which again means thorn, bramble, bush, or thorny plant. There's only one time that it is used in the Gospel of John. Anyone want to take a guess? John 19 says, "The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and dressed him in a purple robe, and they kept coming up to him saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews,' and slapping him over and over." The only reason thorns exist in this world is because of our sin, and that is what is placed on the head of our Messiah. And when we bring an offering to him before the Lord to gain entry into his presence, what do? We place our hand on the head of that offering. And it's like the sin that we are guilty of is transferred to that. It represents us. It makes atonement for us. And that is the way which was made for us to draw near to God. And if we've never been a part of that process, if we've never looked at this and studied this, we don't really understand exactly what was going on. We don't really understand the significance of this moment where the crown of thorns, the crown of sin was placed on him, and it's our hand that rests there to place it. And yet it is because of exactly that, because of what's right here in the first 4 verses of Leviticus, that the picture of what is happening with our Savior is right there. A way was made for us to draw near to God. And so we can then approach the throne of grace with confidence by the blood of the Lamb.